a little bit about how we're thinking about growing your e-commerce platform. So what goes into launching an e-commerce platform? Topics include the strategy, how we're looking at budgeting, marketing, and positioning. One of the things that I think is so important is as we think about e-commerce and the future of e-commerce, there's a long tail strategy here, which is that e-commerce is extremely important for you to be thinking about optimization. But certainly, hey there, thanks for joining. But certainly if your business is not positioned or your brand identity is not strong enough, honestly, it doesn't really matter how great your website functionality is because your branding isn't there. And so there are kind of three different components, right, to understanding your e-com platform. There's your brand identity. There's also your notion of your brand DNA. So who are you? And then you also move from brand DNA to identity to then things like your communication and marketing strategy. Now, recently I worked on a project for a website launch, and the client was like, hey, well, the website doesn't have the content that I want. And I said, well, we don't have your communication strategy. We don't know what to write for that content, right? So, we can take stabs at writing things, but it's really not in your best interest as a brand, as someone who's launching something, to say, hey, I want you to keep writing long form content. And I want you to kind of guess how it is I want to communicate. So that's really, there's a missing link there, right? So you shouldn't actually go and write copy for any website unless you actually have a comm strategy. So what is a comm strategy? It's basically, this is how we communicate. These are the words that we say. This is what we don't say. This is how we announce this kind of information. This is how we announce that kind of information. And as we're kind of taking a look, communication principles, right? It's extremely important to know what is on brand and what's not on brand. And honestly, if you can't tell me what on brand is, then how's anyone supposed to write anything for you? And also, how are you going to be consistent? So imagine if you write your own website copy, but then your business grows and you need to hire someone else to write your copy. Well, if you're actually don't know what your brand voice is, then guys, let me tell you, no one's going to be able to write it for you, right? You're going to kind of end up in this position where you wrote something and it was in your voice, whatever your voice is, which is oftentimes unquantifiable. And then somehow you're expecting other people to run your social media, or you're expecting them to run your advertising, or to write your website copy, or to write your blog posts. So guys, it's not just about how do I hire the people to do the things for me and here's what I've produced. It's more like, have you created the frameworks and the playground by which you're actually looking to build something off of? If you do not have frameworks in the playground, then you actually are not building anything substantial, nor can you actually hand that over for anyone else to run and optimize and build for you. So there are some significant issues here around not just, hey, I launched my site and now I need people to work with me and help me. It's more like, how am I implementing the right building blocks to be able to have the foundation, have it be strong, know what I'm saying, know what the messaging is, know what the cadence is. Then how do I find the right people to then help me execute that and help me kind of further build that out externally? So if you haven't done the internal stuff, don't do the external stuff, right? It's like people who tell me like, hey, I think I need marketing. I think my business needs marketing. And I'm like, actually, what you need is to have a stronger understanding of your brand value proposition. And you need to be able to tell me who your customer is and how you're approaching them and what the other strategies are that you're implementing. So guys, it's just simply not as easy as that, right? It's not as easy as I'm ready, let's do it. It's more like, be thoughtful, be methodical. And, I know we've been kind of keeping up to date a little bit on what's happening in the world and kind of global crisis and retail and everything else. And if there was ever a better time to be focusing on your business and to be taking incremental steps towards building something for sustainable growth, this is the time. I currently sit on the board of directors for a really amazing nonprofit called the Downtown Women's Center, largest women's homeless nonprofit that is in Los Angeles. And we are talking about our social enterprise the other day, and we're talking about how to be looking at forecasting 3 years out. And I just was so shocked because I was like, how on earth are we supposed to be forecasting 3 years out when we don't even know what tomorrow is going to bring us? So the concept of looking at things very agile is important. How are you kind of taking advantage of the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought this was going to be a 6-month issue or a 3-month issue, and then it became 6 months, and now we're hearing, 1.5 to 2 years. So it's not a matter of how do I protect my business through the holiday season. This is a bit more, this is more important than that. The question here is, how am I actually building my business strategically to grow and to maybe take on some new and diverse directions in the next 1.5 to 2 years? And honestly, guys, e-commerce is probably going to be a big part of that, So I was on another phone call with someone else the other day, and she's a luxury brand, and she was like, I'm selling luxury jewelry, and I want to grow my business to scale it, and I want to eventually go through a mergers and acquisition, and I want to get bought. And I was like, amazing. So like, how are you going to grow and scale it in an industry, in the luxury jewelry industry, which is actually very difficult to scale, right? Well, one of the strategies we talked about was introducing a more mass market price point. We're heading into a really unusual time period in our global economies, and we need to be thinking not just in terms of short-term mitigation, but actually just long-term strategic plays. How are we going to pivot in a way that's very strategic, that allows us to have many options to be able to actually do something that's meaningful, right? So that's kind of the mental framework that you should be applying. Now, when it comes to budgeting for your website, when it comes to kind of thinking about how to grow in your, you want to have, again, your DNA, you want to have your brand identity, you should have a communication strategy, and then you move into website development. Now, for us, when we develop websites, we're looking at about 3 months, depending on the functionalities, depending on the scope of work. But give yourself about 3 months to build a website. And then also, guys, like, price point matters. So if you're spending $5,000 on a website, you might be saying to yourself, well, shouldn't I be getting a lot for $5,000? It's just a template. And guys, that's like the worst, like most uneducated thing I've ever heard, right? It's just a template. There is so much that goes into website development, into strategic content planning, into understanding how things navigate and flow, that it's never going to be just a template. And the moment that you say, well, it's just a template, what you're actually doing is kind of minimizing the amount of work and effort and expertise that it takes in order to build it out. And I'm sure you've seen it before, but when you go onto a website that is just a template, guess what? It looks like just a template. And guess what? Your customer will say, this is just a template. This isn't actually very dynamic or interesting. And guess what? I may or may not shop on here, right? So the opportunity for conversion is a lot lower when you're just using templates kind of out the box on a platform like Shopify. So budgets, I think, unless you have a good friend who's an expert at web development and design, $5,000 I think is a really small budget. Remember, when you're building a website, guys, it's not that you have, a designer and a developer in one. Chances are you're hiring a designer and a developer, right? Your designer is there to make sure that things are beautiful, there's good user flow, that it's actually, set up to be conversion friendly. They're thinking about the content, they're thinking about the purpose, they're thinking about this brand DNA and comm strategy kind of coming to life through the vehicle of your website. So I would be really mindful of that, right? It's not simply just about, hey, I'm going to hire this person. They're just going to like push play, right? And all of a sudden it turns on. Otherwise, you could just do it yourself. So I would say be wary of things that are very inexpensive. Like most things, you kind of get what you pay for, but also make sure you're enabling your design team to really be able to execute for you. So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but if you've ever explained an idea to someone and you explain the same idea to someone else and the same idea to another person, and all three of those people come back with different understandings, it's not because you necessarily like did a bad job. You might have said the same thing to 3 different people, but those 3 different people maybe had different learning styles. Those 3 different people have different experiences. And just like the color blue can take on so many variations and shades, right? When you're giving an idea and you're communicating a creative direction, you need to be very specific, right, about what you're looking for. So that's why this brand DNA becomes important, because it kind of becomes this leveraging point whereby you can syndicate it to all parties that you need. And then all of a sudden everyone has the same information and it's visual and verbal, etc. So you've got to have some sort of foundational thing to syndicate. Otherwise, what you end up with is like 3 or 5 different people who have 3 or 5 different understandings of your business. And you're like, but I said the same thing. Like, why aren't people understanding? So we want to avoid that in the process of how you're building your website, right? We want to make sure that you are getting exactly what it is that you are paying for, but more importantly, that you end up with the right platform to ultimately push out your brand. That means that you've thought about things like, do I need a blog or not? Is this going to be a website that's like fully shoppable with lots of SKUs? Or maybe there aren't a lot of SKUs on it, right? So going into this, understanding your future financial growth of your business, right? I want to have 6 collections a year, and they're probably each going to have 20 SKUs. So holy bananas, you probably need to have different categories, right? You don't want to launch something and say, I'm just launching this for today, and when tomorrow comes around, I'm going to, have to go back to the drawing board and rechange my homepage and the rest of the site. You really want to be thinking about building your foundation for growth. All right, let's take some questions here. I currently do all of my copy for my website and social media. What's a good way to stay inspired to keep the flow? I think this is a really good question. So guys, when you're thinking about writing website and copy, super duper important that you are actually writing down the key components of what creates your brand voice. So that means you're saying things like, okay, this is how we talk about things, right? This is what changes for us. This is what's on brand. This is what's not on brand. When you're a business of one, it's easy to say that brand is, it's you. But that's kind of thinking of it more like a hobby, right? When you have a hobby, you have the business for yourself, right? You have it for yourself. When you have a business, you're creating it for other people. And if you're creating something for other people, you actually want to have a standardized and cohesive way of expressing your business across those different channels and platforms. And if you do not have a cohesive strategy behind how you're expressing it, it's going to be disjointed. So to answer your question about staying inspired while writing, to understand different kinds of copy, I would say take a look at your competitive set and understand kind of key voice principles. It's a little bit challenging. It's almost like me telling you, hey, you have to write a contract, go online and do some research on contracts and then kind of make up your own. It's not going to be as great as hiring a lawyer to write your contracts. However, you might be able to do a decent enough job in order to get by with standardization. But I think the most important thing here is making sure that whatever you do consistently. Now, a few years ago, I used to have this perspective, and I hold it true today, that is, you don't need to be everywhere at once. People would get on the phone with me and say, hey, well, don't I need to be on Pinterest and on Snapchat and on Twitter and on this thing and on that thing? And I just was like, guys, if you can't even do one thing right, why are you trying to do a whole bunch of things wrong? Just focus on perfecting a thing, right? And then build off of your thing. So similarly, right, when it comes to website copy, newsletter copy, copy lives everywhere. It is one of the more important things that we have to think about, right? Copy as well as your photography. So yes, if you have a natural inclination and you're inspired to do it yourself, hook yourself up and take a copywriting class, right? Make sure that you write down some of the fundamental principles of how to be a good writer. I'm an okay writer, right? I'm great at ideas. I love being on camera. Video is my thing. Writing, like, you know, I do some writing for Forbes, and like, I guess my writing is good enough for them, but like, it's pretty much just how I talk. You know, I don't do any like long form strategic writing. It's really just what's on my mind and what am I thinking. But I would say, you know, really start to take some of those, really start to take some of that learning component for yourself and say, if I'm going to really DIY my business, well, how am I going to DIY my business in a way that is scalable? And so I really want you guys to be thinking in terms of scale kind of more than anything else. Guys, great time to continue to ask me some questions, important so we don't save them till the very end and then I have to run. As per usual, if you guys are having questions on business strategy, marketing, e-commerce development, all of those sorts of things, really happy to jump in and answer those questions. A couple key things that I think are important to recognize, like when you guys are, you know, looking at building out these channels and building out your conversion and really starting to understand what is success to you. Don't get too, you know, don't get too caught up in, don't get too caught up kind of in what industry standards are. Use those as loose benchmarks. I had another client the other day ask me, you know, oh, what does it look like for, you know, what's a good example of website traffic? And I'm like, well, like, depends how long you've been in business, right? It depends on how much you're spending on advertising. It depends on like so many factors. There are a couple of key benchmarks, things like, you know, the average website conversion for e-commerce is about 1.84%. The top 25% of websites convert at a little bit over 6%. So those things are important to know because those are your goals, right? You want to kind of be incrementally moving in that direction. Most e-commerce newsletter, 15% and a click-through of 2%. And like benchmarks are good, but your incremental and your delta is the most important thing. So wherever you're starting from, take a look at like your few months of traction and then start to develop kind of what your processes are. Okay, we've got some questions. Thanks, guys. Platforms should you be promoting on when launching e-commerce business to get noticed? Instagram, it's a great platform, depending on what you're selling. Also, Pinterest is very good. Who did the website development? We did it in-house. So I have an in-house design development team. We run a marketing agency and creative studio as well as retail consulting. So we did it our own. Trust me, the one we have today is like so much nicer than the one we had back in the day. Our site has gone through iterations, and if you're eager or curious to see what they are, one of my favorite platforms is called the Wayback Machine. And if you go like way back, so, you know, I've had scaling retail now for, gosh, about 8 years. And so if you go into the Wayback Machine and you look like even 5 years ago, you'd be like, damn, it's like there's been some progress. So you can have iterations, but guys, remember, I have a service-based business, right? It's like people are converting based on my expertise, based on so many things. Not necessarily always because it looks pretty, though today it definitely speaks and looks a lot prettier. Should you build e-commerce yourself? No. Is it too expensive to get help on that? It is, it can be expensive, and it is important to set aside resources for that. Otherwise, you might be wasting your money. And everyone has a friend of a friend that does website stuff. So be careful. It's like that friend of a friend might not like be very good, you know? So like be wary of anything that's free or anything that's too good to be true. When it comes to being a startup, you know, money is tight, and no matter how much money you have, money is tight. And you want to be investing in the right thing. So it's not necessarily about slashing budgets on everywhere. It's about saying, I'm going to spend more money in this area because it's going to have a better long-term payoff than putting money in this other area, which is going to have a different kind of payoff, right? So your payoff and trade-offs, if you will, need to be assessed as you're doing your resource allocation. Okay, how do you recommend going about honing in on your customer segmentation? Okay, so guys, when we're talking about customer segmentation, it's probably not going to be a, customer segmentation is, It's tough. So if you're initially just launching your brand, you really want to take a look at how you are, at your like brands, right? And you want to stop looking at customer segmentation in terms of a age range. It's really more of like psychographic data and what is the mentality of this person who you're pitching to. So I recommend, for the purposes of advertising and for building out your price points and all that, to really look at the psychological profiles. I think that's really important. Opinions on AR functionalities on sites. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I just read about it the other day. Actually, I was speaking to the founder of this super interesting startup called Day One, and it's an app, it's a journaling app. And this guy is like really cool, really smart. And I'm wrapping up this class right now at Harvard on disruptive innovation theories. And I wanted to talk to him about how he was looking at his business model. And it was so cool. He was telling me about this thing called GPT-3, which is basically like the next level in artificial intelligence, and how we're looking at transcribing and how we're able to engage with chatbots and online functionality in a way that is so symbiotic with or really synthesizing with like how customers are engaging. I think there's going to be a whole new wave of looking at things like GPT-3 as we build more holistic, integrated online shopping platforms. And I'm super interested in working with brands and people who are exploring that space of the next level of digital AI engagement, and how we actually can scale up these very kind of personal engagements, right? My biggest thing when I think about like customer programming and customer loyalty is, we look at kind of how areas of tech build up, the most efficient ones are the ones that help to reinforce like old school customer service connections, right? CRM systems took the place of like your black book, right? It's like these different technologies that kind of mimic and are able to really support traditional customer service and customer engagement strategies, I think are really amazing. So in terms of like augmented reality and all those other things, yeah, I think it's really cool. I think it's totally something that can be done effectively, efficiently. But you have to ask yourself, do we have a CTO? How are we going to, build that out? What is that going to look like? And how are we going to invest our resources? Because chances are, if you're moving in that direction, that's kind of a very resource heavy, it's a resource heavy thing that you guys are embarking on. All right, other questions. What platforms do I recommend perfecting first? Obviously, guys, when it comes again to social media, I would say perfect your Instagram, depending on your customer demo. Some customers might be living on TikTok or Snapchat, in which case you want to perfect those first. Your main motto in social media needs to be, I need to be where my customer is. So where is your customer? I don't know. Do you know? Do you know your brand? Do you know where your customer is? Figure that part out. Figure out where your customer is. If you know where your customer is, you're going to be able to market to your customer. If you do not know where your customer is, you're not going to be able to market to them, and you're going to end up spending a lot of time and resources in ways that are really inefficient and time consuming and aren't going to make you any money. How can you combine... Okay, it's a great question. How do you combine your brand identity and copy that will respond well with SEO? Okay, so SEO is like, okay, so here's the thing with SEO. It's like SEO takes forever. So anybody who's like, yeah, you need SEO. Yeah, you do need SEO. Guess what? The moment you launch your website, you got SEO. SEO is like, SEO is essentially what Google and other, search engine tools are crawling your website for. So organically in Shopify, right? It's like, it will already extract information, right? It's already doing it as we speak. The question is, right, how are you going to boost visibility? So boosting visibility becomes a totally separate strategy, right? SEO is already happening, but boosting visibility is important. So how do you boost visibility? Well, you can boost visibility by instituting great public relations and getting your URL posted in a bunch of different places, which then increases, right, your search because it is, there is domain authority in there, right? It's like people are saying, okay, you got written up in Vogue.com, right? That is, that's a really great, has high domain authority, and that's going to help you gain in SEO. So you want to be looking at that. I would be a little bit, worried about some of these old school strategies around like, hey, we're going to go around the internet and write comments in people's blogs and drop your link in there, right? It's like, well, that might increase some of your traffic. People might have your link posted in more places, but if someone does a Google search for your name and all of a sudden you got some random comments on there, like, not a good look, right? So I would be careful of things that feel a little disingenuous, right? Craig, your ideas here on customers write positive reviews, I think that's great. Also, keeping your content fresh. So if your content is not fresh, guess what? Like, it loses its ranking and it loses its validity. So I would say, when you're thinking about search engine optimization and you're like, how do I do that? Number one, you're already doing it. So if you are, if your copy on your website is not created to convert and you don't already have the keywords you want to rank for, then make sure you have the right copy on there. But know that that alone isn't really going to do anything for you. It's like, yeah, maybe over time. Back in the day, I had Scaling Retail hosted on a URL called NYC Retail Consultants. This is like 2009, right? Is when I bought that domain. And I was going to turn into Scaling Retail. I was like, I'm a New York City retail consultant. Guess what? Over time, right? Like, people typing in those search words were able to find me. But is that a sexy brand name? Like, not really, right? It's like most fashion brands are not going to be called something that is like so obvious, right? So, I was able to win on that front, but it's not necessarily the easiest kind of one-to-one if you're a fashion or consumer-facing brand. So I would say make sure your website kind of is already written very keyword sensitive, and then look at kind of these other link building, kind of brand building things. All right, we're going to take one more question, guys, and then I am going to, and then I'm going to bounce because I get to have lunch. Okay. What are some of the job titles you need when building an online brand? That's great. Job titles. Gosh. So you're going to want an online merchandiser to help you with like inventory management and pagination and kind of launching new products. And you're going to need a developer, a designer to help you with building the site and also maintenance. The other thing that's really funny is most people are like, oh, but why is there a bug on my site? It's like, dude, websites just break down. They're faulty by nature. You have so many plugins, things are updating. Like, the line item budget for technology maintenance is like something most people just don't even remember to put in there. So critical. There's just so many things. There was a time last year and like the last few years where I was getting these crazy DDoS attacks. And I was like, why on earth would someone want to do that to me? Like, I was like, how did I get like roped into this like crazy world of website craziness? But it happened, right? So there went my technology budget. And I had to do a lot of maintenance on that. So that's a line item you're going to probably keep for a while. You might also have an onboarded graphic designer you're using consistently. I'm trying to think of who else you're probably going to be hiring. Maybe someone operationally to help you with like fulfillment. That's also important. If your products aren't being shipped, you're in big trouble because you got a website, but how are you doing that? Also making sure that you have someone like your accountant is really well versed in understanding kind of Shopify and what the chart of accounts needs to look like in terms of reconciliation. That's also very difficult. Not all accountants, bookkeepers are familiar with that. So there are a host of job descriptions, but I think those are kind of the main ones. Let's see, guys, last question here. Okay, last question. How do I feel about guerrilla marketing? It's really funny because these days I'm like, what would be like guerrilla marketing? Like that's like, okay, you're on Sunset in LA and you got like posters, right? Or people handing things out, or like, I think of like street teams and, I think of like being on the ground. And so now when I think of like, instead of guerrilla marketing, I would use the term, attention arbitrage, right? Like, how are you capturing people in a way that other people are not capturing them, right? So I kind of reframe the question, like, where is there market share that you are not currently being exposed to? And how might you actually re-expose yourself or expose yourself to that market in a way that's less expensive before everyone else gets there? So I think guerrilla marketing, if you reframe that to like, how do I capture low-hanging fruit? What are the channels that are not being activated that could be activated? I think it's great. I just don't know if the term guerrilla marketing and the way that I'm used to hearing it accurately defines the way I'm thinking about it. But like street marketing, pop-up marketing, things that are on the ground, love it. Just don't know how appropriate that is right now. I don't know what kind of bang you're going to get. I just did an interview for a publication yesterday on experiential stores. And I said, and the concept was like, oh, well, don't people want to have experiences? And I said, yeah, but like, if I own a billboard on Sunset Avenue and there are no cars and no one's driving, what's the point of having the billboard on Sunset? Like, yeah, that's cool, but like, if no one's seeing it, does it matter? And so I would ask yourself that with marketing in general, right? Like where can you go to capture market share where you're going to see it will convert? So that's the way I think about it. All right, guys, that is all for me. I'm a little bit over. Stomach is getting a little grumbly. Always great to be on here to talk to you guys. I am doing these kind of, small group live sessions through Embark, and that's really cool. And so if you guys are interested in like talking about business, getting some more specific ideas, please make sure you sign up when those things are happening, because it's always a pleasure to be able to get to know you guys a little bit better, get to know your businesses better. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys later.